The red dust of Mars swirled outside the dome of New Villisca Research Station. Detective Hejum Kim stood at the entrance, his breath steady inside his protective suit. The emergency light on his wrist computer kept blinking. Code red. Family of 5. No response for 48 hours. Computer, open entrance lock, he said. The door slid open with a soft hiss. The main hall was dark, too dark. Hejum touched the light panel, but nothing happened. He switched on his suit lights and walked forward. The beam cut through the darkness, showing empty coffee cups on desks and half-finished work on screens. Everything looked normal, except for the silence. "Hello, this is Detective Kim. Is anyone here?" His voice echoed through the empty halls. No answer. He checked his tablet. The Park family lived and worked here. Dr. Jae-ho Park, the lead researcher, his wife Sunmei, and their 3 children. 5 people, all missing. Hejum walked deeper into the station. His footsteps made soft sounds on the metal floor. He passed the kitchen, where a pot of soup sat cold on the stove. In the living room, he found tablets scattered on the couch, showing children's games still running. The detective felt uneasy. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Then he saw it. A light, blinking slowly in the dark hallway ahead. He followed it to a heavy door marked Research Lab A. The door was slightly open. Hejum pushed it wider. The room was filled with tall metal tubes, suspension pods, the kind used for long space travel. But these weren't meant for travel. His light beam fell on the first pod. Inside, floating in clear liquid, was Dr. Jae-ho Park. His eyes were closed. He looked peaceful, almost like he was sleeping. But the pod's screen told a different story. The consciousness matrix readout showed flat lines. All of them. Hejum moved to the next pod. Sunmei Park. The same flat lines. Then the children's pods. All the same. They weren't dead, not in the old way. Their bodies were perfectly preserved. But their minds, the electrical patterns that made them who they were, had been cut off. Severed. Like someone had taken an axe to their consciousness itself. The detective's eyes caught something on Dr. Park's desk. A research log, still glowing on the screen. The last entry was dated 2 days ago. Made contact. The temporal bridge is stable. I can see Villisca, 1912. The Moore House. But something else sees me too. It's not what we thought. Not at all. It's coming through. Sunmei, get the children to thee. The entry ended there. Hejum looked at the date again. June 10, 2412. Exactly 500 years after the original Villisca Axe Murders on Earth. His mind raced back to the old case files he'd studied in the academy. 8 people murdered in their sleep. The killer never found. He touched his communicator. Control, this is Detective Kim. Send a quantum forensics team to New Villisca Station. Priority 1. He paused, looking at the pods again. And get me everything we have on the 1912 Villisca murders. I don't think they're as unsolved as we thought. Behind him, in the darkness of the lab, a shadow moved, just for a second. And in the cold air of the Martian research station, Hejum could have sworn he heard the soft sound of an axe being dragged across metal floor. But when he turned around, there was nothing there. Nothing but the red dust of Mars, swirling outside the windows, and 5 bodies floating in their pods, their minds cut off from the world by something that had reached through 5 centuries of time to find them. The forensics team arrived 3 hours later. Hejum watched as they set up their equipment around the suspension pods. The machines hummed softly, scanning the Park family's frozen bodies. Detective Kim. A woman in a white coat walked up to him. I'm Yoon-hee Lee, quantum forensics specialist. We found something strange in Dr. Park's research logs. Hejum followed her to the main computer. Old pictures filled the screen. Black and white images of a White House from 1912 Earth. The Moore House in Villisca, Iowa. Dr. Park was obsessed with the Villisca murders, Yoon-hee explained. She pulled up more files. He created a machine to look into the past. Not just records, but actual windows through time. Hajum leaned closer to the screen. Why these murders? Because nothing made sense about them. He opened another file. 8 people killed in their sleep. All the mirrors in the house covered. No real suspects. Dr. Park thought there was more to the story. The detective remembered the last log entry. He said he made contact. That something saw him too. He nodded. She pressed a button, and a video started playing. It showed Dr. Park sitting at his desk, recording a message. Day 89 of the Villisca project, Dr. Park said in the video. The temporal viewer is working better than we hoped. We can see into the Morehouse clearly now. But there's something else. He looked nervous. When we watch the house, something watches back. Today, it noticed us. The video jumped. Now Dr. Park looked scared. It's not human. It never was. The original murders, they weren't done by a person. It used the axe because that's what people would understand. But it's so much older than that. And now it knows we're here. Hajum felt cold. When was this recorded? 2 days before they disappeared. He pointed to another screen. Look at this. The screen showed a diagram of the Park family's brain patterns. Strange dark lines cut through them, like black lightning. Their consciousness matrices weren't just turned off, he said. They were cut, with something that exists in 2 times at once. The same way the original victims were killed. But at a quantum level, Hajum finished. It copied the original murders. Why? They heard a noise from the lab. A soft thud, like metal hitting metal. Both turned to look. Dr. Park's temporal viewer sat in the corner. Its screen was on, showing fuzzy images. Hajum walked closer. The images cleared. He saw a bedroom from 1912. A family sleeping. Shadows moving in the dark. And in the corner of the room, a mirror. It wasn't covered. In the mirror's reflection, Hajum saw something that made his heart stop. A figure standing in the Morehouse, holding an axe. And behind it, through a window that shouldn't be there, the red dust of Mars swirled. It didn't just copy the murders, Hajum said quietly. It's trying to connect them, to make a bridge between then and now. He turned to Yuni. We need to find out why, and we need to do it fast. The temporal viewer's screen flickered. For a second, Hajum thought he saw something in the lab's reflection, a dark shape moving between the pods. But when he looked back, there was only the empty lab. And on Dr. Park's desk, a small mirror lay shattered. Hajum hadn't noticed it before. Its broken pieces showed only darkness, even under the bright lab lights. The detective reached for his communicator. Control, we need a historical research team. Everything about the Villisca murders. And he looked at the broken mirror again. Get me someone who knows about quantum entanglement. I think we just found out how our killer moves through time. The research lab was filled with new machines. Screens showed brain wave patterns and time readings. Hajum stood with Yumi, looking at the latest test results. Look at this, he said. She pointed to a screen showing the Park family's brain patterns. Their minds aren't gone. They're somewhere else. Hajum moved closer. The patterns weren't flat anymore. They showed tiny spikes, like weak radio signals from far away. Where are they? He asked. That's the strange part. He typed on her keyboard. A new image appeared. It showed 2 timelines side by side. Their consciousness signals are coming from 1912. Hajum felt his mouth go dry. They're in the past. Not exactly. He walked to the quantum axe they had found. It floated in a special container, shifting between being solid and see-through. This weapon exists in both times at once. When it cut their consciousness patterns, it sent them between times. A light started blinking on one of the machines. He rushed over to it. We're getting something. A message. Static filled the main screen. Then words began to appear. The typing was slow, like someone using the last of their strength. Help. We see it now. Not human. Feeds on fear, pain. Used Villisca Murders to make anchor point. Needs new one here. On Mars. Stop it. Please. Jai-Ho Park. An anchor point? Hejun asked. Yoon-hee's face went pale. Of course. The Mars colonies. Humanity is spreading to the stars. It needs new feeding grounds. The lights in the lab flickered. In the dark moments, they heard something moving. Metal against metal. Like an axe being dragged across the floor. We need to reach them, Hejun said. Can we use Park's temporal viewer? Yoon-hee was already moving to the machine. Yes, but... She stopped. We'd be putting ourselves at risk. The entity might trap us too. Hejun looked at the Park family, floating in their pods. We have to try. They set up the temporal viewer. Yoon-hee made adjustments while Hejun watched the shadows. The machine hummed louder. Ready, Yoon-hee said. This will link our minds to 1912. We'll be able to see and hear what's happening there. The screen lit up. They saw the Moore-house in Villisca, but something was different. Through the windows, they could see the Park family, walking like ghosts among the sleeping people of 1912. There, Hejun pointed. In the corner of the room, a darkness moved. It had no real shape, but it held something that looked like an axe. The entity, Yoon-hee whispered, it's preparing to kill the Moore family, to make its first anchor point. And the Parks saw this. Is that why it took them? Yes. They were going to expose it, so it trapped them in time, between its first feeding ground and its next one. The darkness in the image turned. It seemed to look right at them. The temporal viewer's screen cracked. It knows we're watching, Yoon-hee said. Her voice shook. Hejun grabbed her arm. We need to go back. All the way back. To 1912. That's too dangerous. It's the only way. We have to stop both murders at once. Break its connection to both times. The lights went out again. When they came back, all the mirrors in the lab were broken. And on the wall, written in what looked like frost, were words. Time is my home. Fear is my food. You cannot stop what has already happened. Hejun looked at Yoon-hee. Can you send us back? She nodded slowly. Yes, but if we fail, then we'll be trapped between times too, Hejun finished. Like the Parks. The darkness was getting closer. They could feel it now. Cold, hungry, ancient. They had to decide fast. Stay and face it in the present, or risk everything by going to the past. The choice would change history, if they survived to make it. The reconstructed data from Dr. Park's computer filled the main screen. Hejun and Yoon-hee watched as years of research played before them. They had to understand what they were facing before they could fight it. Look at this, Yoon-hee said. She pointed to a pattern that appeared in Dr. Park's readings. The entity leaves the same energy signature in every murder it causes, not just in Villisca. Hejun leaned forward. The data showed similar patterns across history, all connected to mysterious mass killings, all unsolved. It's been here all along, he said quietly, using our tragedies to feed itself. Dr. Park's voice came from an old recording. The entity is not evil in the way we understand it. It's hungry. Earth was its feeding ground for thousands of years. But now humanity is spreading to Mars. It needs new hunting grounds, new anchors for its power. The lights in the lab dimmed. The air grew cold. Both Hejun and Yoon-hee felt it. A presence. Watching. Listening. It's here, Yoon-hee whispered. In the corner of the lab, darkness gathered. It took shape slowly. Not quite human. Not quite anything they could name. It held something that looked like an axe, but the weapon seemed to shift and change, like it wasn't fully in their time. Dr. Park's recording continued. The entity exists between moments, between thoughts. It feeds on fear, on pain, on the darkness in human minds. The Villisca murders were special to it. A perfect moment of terror frozen in time. The shape moved closer. Each step it took left frost on the floor. The computers began to show strange readings. "Why the Park family?" Hajun asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Why them?" The entity stopped. It seemed to consider the question. Then, in their minds, they heard a voice. Ancient, cold, hungry. "They saw me," it said. Through their machines, they looked back in time. Saw my feeding. My perfect moment. They would have warned humanity. Stopped the expansion to Mars. Taken away my new hunting ground. Yoon-hee worked quickly at her computer, recording the entity's energy patterns. "The Parks aren't dead," she said. "You trapped them between times. Like the Moore family in 1912. They watch now," the entity agreed. "Forever caught between my past feast and my future one. Two perfect moments of terror, connected across time." Hajun stepped forward. "We'll stop you. We know what you are now." The entity made a sound like breaking ice. Maybe it was laughing. "Humans, you understand so little. Time is not a line. It is a web. And I am the spider." The temporal viewer sparked to life. In its screen, they could see the Moore house in 1912. And through its windows, the red dust of Mars swirled. The entity was connecting the times, making them one. "You'll join them," it said. "Watch forever. Feed me forever." But Hajun had seen something in the data. A weakness. The entity needed these connections, these anchors in time, and if they could break them. "Yoon-hee," he said softly. "The quantum bonds. If we disrupt them in both times at once." She nodded, understanding. "We could break its hold, free both families." The entity moved closer. The axe in its hands began to glow with a cold light. "You cannot change what has already happened," it said. "No," Hajun agreed, "but we can change what's happening now. In both times." The battle for two times was about to begin, and history itself hung in the balance. Time travel felt like falling through ice-cold water. Hajun and Yoon. He found themselves standing on a dirt road in 1912 Villisca. The summer night was warm, but they felt cold inside. Did it work? Yoon-hee checked her time device. Yes. June 10, 1912. Hours before the original murders. The Moore house stood before them. It looked exactly like the old photographs. Lights were still on inside. Through the windows, they could see the family moving around, getting ready for bed. "The Parks must be here too," Hajun said. "Between times." As if answering him, they saw shapes moving through the walls, like ghosts made of mist. The Park family, trapped between 1912 and 2412. Dr. Park's ghost saw them. He tried to speak. No sound came, but they could read his lips. "Behind you." They turned. The entity stood at the end of the street. In this time, it looked more solid, more human, but its eyes were wrong. Too dark, too hungry. "Time travelers," it said. Its voice sounded like dead leaves in winter. "Come to change history. Come to stop you," Hojun said. "In both times." The entity lifted its axe. The weapon glowed with a strange light. "You understand nothing. This moment feeds me. The fear, the pain, it echoes through time. Makes me stronger. That's why you want Mars," Yoon-hee said. "New victims, new echoes. Humanity spreads to the stars." The entity moved closer. "I follow. Feed. Grow." Inside the house, they heard people getting ready for bed. Soon, the Moore family would sleep. In a few hours, in the original timeline, they would die. "We won't let that happen," Hajun said. He pulled out a quantum disruptor, a device they had made using Dr. Park's research. "Not here. Not on Mars." The entity laughed. The sound made flowers wilt and grass turn brown. "You cannot change the past." "No," Yoon-hee agreed. She held up her own device. "But we can change how it connects to the future." They activated the disruptors. Beams of light shot out, cutting through the air. Where they crossed, reality itself seemed to bend. The entity screamed. The sound shattered windows up and down the street. Its form flickered, showing its true shape for a moment. Something old. Something that had lived in the spaces between times since before humans existed. The quantum bonds, he shouted. They're weakening. The Park family's ghost shapes became clearer, more solid. Dr. Park reached out, trying to tell them something. But the entity wasn't finished. It swung its axe, cutting through time itself. Hajun felt reality twist around them. For a moment, he saw both times at once. The wooden walls of 1912 and the metal halls of Mars in 2412. He called. We have to close the loop. Both times at once. She nodded, understanding. They had one chance, one moment to save two families, 500 years apart. The entity raised its axe again. Behind it, the Morehouse flickered, showing the Mars research station instead. 2 times. 2 places, one moment of violence about to repeat. They had to stop it, had to break its connection, had to save both families. The final battle was about to begin, and time itself held its breath. In the quantum space between times, Hajun and Yoon, he saw the full truth. The entity showed them visions of its past, perhaps trying to make them understand, or perhaps trying to break their will. They saw ancient Earth when the entity first arrived. It had come from the spaces between stars, drawn to the fears and dreams of early humans. For thousands of years, it had fed on human suffering, creating perfect moments of terror that would echo through time. Your kind spreads disease through space. The entity's voice echoed in their minds. You build your domes on Mars, your stations in space. You take what was mine. The visions changed. They saw the future. Human colonies spreading across Mars, then to other planets, each new settlement pushing the entity's feeding ground smaller. The Villisca murders were special, he said, understanding at last. They created a pattern of fear so strong it echoed through time. You want to make the same pattern on Mars? Yes. The entity's form shifted between times. The Park family found me, saw me. They had to become part of the pattern. Hajun watched as reality flickered around them. In one moment, they stood in 1912 Iowa. In the next, they were in the Mars research station. The entity was connecting the moments, trying to make them one. That's why you chose them, Hajun said. Their research made them perfect targets. They were already connected to the original murders. The entity moved closer. Its axe left trails of darkness in the air. They will watch forever, as you will watch, as all humanity will watch when I spread across your colonies. But something was wrong. The entity seemed worried. Hajun could feel its fear. Yoon-hee, he whispered, look at the quantum readings. She checked her device. Her eyes widened. The connection is weakening. Every time it jumps between moments, the bond gets weaker. They understood now. The entity wasn't showing them its power. It was showing them its desperation. As humanity spread to the stars, its ancient feeding grounds were vanishing. It needed new anchors, new sources of fear. You're not trying to stop us, Hajun said to the entity. You're trying to survive, to adapt. The entity's form became clearer for a moment. They saw its true shape, something ancient and lonely, a being that had lived so long it had forgotten how to die. I must feed, it said. I must continue. Your fear sustains me. But you are weakening, he said. Each jump between times costs you energy. And humanity's growth is forcing you to jump more often. The entity screamed. The sound shattered time itself around them. Through the cracks, they saw other moments, other murders it had caused through history, each one an anchor, each one growing weaker as humanity's understanding of the universe grew stronger. We can help you, Hajun offered. Find another way. No, the entity said. Its voice was cold with ancient hatred. I will have my anchors. I will have my feast. In 1912, on Mars, in all times, it raised its axe. Reality bent around them. The final battle would decide not just the fate of two families, but the future of humanity's expansion into space. And in the quantum space between moments, time held its breath, waiting to see which future would become real. The battle began across two times at once. The entity swung its quantum axe, cutting through the fabric of reality. Hejun and Yoon-hee jumped apart, their quantum disruptors ready. "We have to protect both families," Hejun shouted. In front of him, the Moore House of 1912 flickered in change, showing the Mars research station instead. The two places were becoming one. Yoon-hee checked her readings. "The quantum bonds are getting weaker. Keep it moving between times." The entity understood their plan. It stopped jumping between moments. Instead, it split itself, existing in both times at once. One form stalked through the Moore House, while another moved through the Mars station. "Clever humans," its voice echoed from both times. "But I can be in two places at once. Can you?" Hejun faced the 1912 version of the entity. Its axe glowed with cold blue light. Behind him, he heard the Moore family sleeping, unaware of the battle for their lives. In the Mars station, Yoon-hee confronted the entity's future self. Its form was different here, made of shadows and red dust. The suspended pods holding the Park family glowed behind her. "The quantum field is breaking down," she called to Hejun across time. "We need to force it fully into one time or the other." The entity laughed. The sound cracked windows in 1912 and shorted out computers in 2412. "You cannot stop what has already happened. What will happen? What must happen?" But Hejun saw something the entity didn't. The Park family, still trapped between times, were moving. Their ghost-like forms gathered around the quantum disruptors, adding their own trapped energy to the devices. Dr. Park's voice came faintly through time. "The energy pattern. Reverse it." Yoon-hee understood first. Hejun. The disruptors set them to reflect the entity's own energy. They adjusted their devices. The entity felt the change. It tried to pull its two forms back together, but the weakened quantum bonds made it difficult. "Now," Yoon-hee shouted. They fired their disruptors. The beams hit both forms of the entity, but instead of cutting through it, they reflected its own temporal energy back at it. The entity screamed in two times at once. The Park family's ghost forms became more solid. They were pulling free of the time trap. In 1912, the Moore family woke up, finally able to sense the danger. "Get out," Hejun shouted to them. "Run." The entity thrashed between times, its forms breaking apart. The quantum bonds that held it together were snapping. But as it died, it made one last attempt to complete its purpose. Its axe flew through the air, spinning between times, aimed at both families at once. Hejun and Yoon-hee had a split second to decide. They couldn't save both families at once. Unless they fired their disruptors one last time, crossing the beams. The energy created a temporal mirror, reflecting the axe back at the entity. The weapon that had existed in two times struck its wielder, cutting through its own quantum bonds. The entity's scream echoed across 500 years. Its form collapsed in both times at once, finally unable to exist in two moments. The quantum bonds shattered completely. Reality began to reset itself. The two times pulled apart. The last thing Hejun and Yoon-hee saw was both families, the Moores and the Parks, running to safety. Then everything went white. The white light faded slowly. Hejun opened his eyes to find himself back in the Mars research station. Sunlight streamed through the dome windows. The red dust of Mars swirled outside, peaceful and ordinary. "Yoon-hee," he called out. "Here," she answered, standing up from beside one of the computers. Did it work?" They rushed to check the suspension pods. They were empty. No floating bodies. No trapped minds. The Park family was gone. "Detective Kim," a voice called from the hallway. "What are you doing here?" Hajum turned. Dr. Jaiho Park stood in the doorway, looking confused but very much alive. Behind him, his wife Sunmei and their 3 children peered into the lab curiously. "Dr. Park," Hajum said carefully, "what's the last thing you remember?" Jaiho frowned. "I was working on my temporal viewing project. There was something, a shadow." He shook his head. "Then everything changed. I remember 2 different sets of memories now." "Is that possible?" "Yes," Yoon-hee said. "The timeline has reformed. The entity is gone, but the memory of what happened, what almost happened, remains." They checked the historical records on the computer. The Villisca Axe Murders of 1912 were now listed as an attempted crime. The Moore family had woken up in time, warned by strange noises. They had escaped the house before anything could happen. The killer was never found. 2 sets of memories, Sunmei Park said softly. "I remember being trapped between times, but I also remember a normal life here on Mars. Both feel real." "Both are real," Hajun explained. "When we destroyed the entity, we changed how time flowed. But some memories remained, like echoes." The children seemed fine, already playing with their tablets as if nothing had happened. To them, perhaps, it had all been a strange dream. Yoon-hee was checking more historical records. "Look at this," she said. "All those other murders the entity caused through history. They've changed too. More attempted crimes, more narrow escapes. The pattern of fear it tried to create, it never fully formed." Hajum nodded. "Without those anchor points, it couldn't maintain its presence in our reality. It had to return to the space between stars." Dr. Park looked at his research notes. "My temporal viewer still works. But now it shows a different history, a better one maybe. Though still not perfect." "History is never perfect," Hajun said. "But at least now it's truly human. Our mistakes, our choices, our chances to do better." They looked out at the Martian landscape. Human domes dotted the red plains, gleaming in the sunlight. Humanity's future spreading across the stars. And now it would spread without the shadow of ancient hunger following it. "What do we do now?" Yoon-hee asked. "We keep going forward," Hajun answered. "We remember both histories so we can learn from them. And we watch the spaces between times just in case." Dr. Park smiled. "And we make sure our new history is better than the old one." Later that night, Hajun stood alone in the lab. In the dim light, he thought he saw a flicker of movement in one of the mirrors. But it was just Mars dust, swirling in the wind. The entity was gone. Time had healed itself. He touched his badge and smiled. Some mysteries were better left as just memories, 2 sets of them.